Yeah, so this is the fourth time I've spoken about Bantay, and I got home last night and I remembered something. I gave a talk in 1996 on an order convention on the theme of discipleship. It's something that I'd been reflecting a lot on and feeling a lot about. So I gave this talk on discipleship, and shall I speak a bit louder for you? I'll turn my hearing aid off and then I can shout. So I gave this talk, and towards the end I read some verses of praise of the Buddha by one of his disciples, a disciple called Upali. And beautiful verses, and there's a refrain at the end of each verse that goes, "Of this Lord, the disciple am I." And then there's more praise of him, and then the rephrase again, "Of this Lord, the disciple am I." And I love that the whole verses, it's beautiful. And I wanted to write something like that for Bantay Sangharakshita, but I didn't feel like I could do it justice, so I asked a good friend of mine who loves Bantay to do that, and he wrote 3 verses in that vein. And I asked him to read it at the end of the talk, which he did. And later on, that talk was transcribed and made into a booklet. So I looked it out last night, and this talk is going to be based on those 3 verses, which kind of bring together, really lovely, all the things I've been talking about these last couple of days. And I've only got 20 minutes, so I may not get it through it all, but let's see how far we get. So the verse is this: "Of the fearless one, he who has hacked a path through densest jungle, who has cast into the desert, whose deep, dark eyes never waver from essential purpose, the translator, revealer of hidden treasure, of that man, the disciple am I." I asked my friend not to say "of that Lord, the disciple am I," because I didn't think Bantay would be very happy being called that Lord, but "of that man, the disciple am I." So that's the first verse. So I'm just going to say a few words about that. He starts off by saying, "Of the fearless one." So Bantay is fearless. This is something I talked about quite a lot yesterday. I don't know if he was fearless or courageous, because the two things are slightly different. When you're fearless, you have no fear. When you're courageous, you do have fear, but you face that fear. And I think sometimes Bantay was fearless, and sometimes he was just simply courageous. And this is one of the... yesterday I talked about Bantay's qualities. This is the first one that I picked out, because one of the things I most admired about Bantay was his courage. Especially his courage to speak, and especially his courage to speak sometimes unpopular things, unpopular truths, things that he considered at least to be truth. And sometimes he made enemies that way. I don't know if you know much about him, but he's made a number of enemies along the way, and it's because, partly at least because, he was willing to say what he really thought. And he did this quite courageously. Really remarkable to watch him do that over a number of years. I really, really love that about him. Yesterday I spoke about one incident. You talked about the European Buddhist Union, and there was a European Buddhist Union convention in Berlin many years ago now. And at the end of that convention, there were various well-known, even famous Buddhist teachers. There was Sangharakshita, there was Sogyal Rinpoche, there was Thich Nhat Hanh, and there was a Burmese monk who wasn't famous at all, not in the West anyway. And they were being asked questions, and they were doing what Buddhist teachers always do. You know, I don't know if you ever watched Buddhist teachers do that kind of thing, but very urbane, very funny, making fun of themselves and so on. It was all really good until somebody asked a question about centres, Buddhist centres. I can't remember what it was, but Thich Nhat Hanh answered. And Thich Nhat Hanh was very, very popular at that time. Well, he's a very popular teacher now, but he was like at the height of his fame then. And he said, well, the main thing is that the people running the centres have to be happy. That's the main thing. And the adjudicator of the panel was just about to ask someone else, what about another question? But Bantay said, hold on a minute, if I may say so, I don't agree with that. I don't think you can be happy all the time. You can't be happy all the time. You can be friendly. No matter how you're feeling, you can be friendly. And that's the most important thing that people need to do at centres. And he didn't leave it there. He then turned to Thich Nhat Hanh and spoke to him personally, and he said, and if you don't mind me saying so, yesterday you looked rather sad, I thought. And that's fine, because sometimes we are sad. We can't always be happy. It's well worth watching that. I'm sure you can get it on YouTube. It's a real lesson in how to be truthful in a difficult situation. So that really I really admire that in Bantay. But the writer of this, I'm not supposed to say who the writer was. I haven't told you, have I? No. No, good. So don't let me say who it was, because he wanted to remain anonymous. There's so much in this verse, but he who has hacked a path through the densest jungle. You may wonder what all that's about, because he didn't actually hack a path through any jungle, but he had to find his way. He was in a different generation from us, where Buddhism wasn't all over the place. You know, it wasn't freely available. He was conscripted into the army in the war, the Second World War, and he was posted, of all places, to India. And from there, he left the army at the end of the war, and he became a homeless wanderer. He and a friend became homeless wanderers, and they did it in the proper traditional way. They burnt their passports, they burnt their papers, they had nothing. No money, nothing, and they just wandered around India looking for Buddhist teachers. Now that takes a lot of courage, an awful lot of courage. So this is one of the things I so much like about Bantay, his courage to do what needs to be done. Who has cast into the desert, into, I suppose, into the wilderness, into the homeless life. And then he says, whose deep, dark eyes never waver from essential purpose. And one of the things that I've been talking about these last couple of days is the fact that when you read his memoirs from that time, he and his friend were looking for a Buddhist teacher for 2 years, and they didn't find one, because Buddhism more or less had died out in India at that time. And they found Hindu teacher after Hindu teacher after Hindu teacher, and they had teachings from them, and they stayed with them, and they learnt a lot from them. And at the end of that 2 years, Bantay still wanted a Buddhist teacher. He was looking for a Buddhist teacher. He wasn't going to be taken aside from that purpose of his. I said yesterday that I think it was me, after 2 years of that, and I thought, oh, what the hell, why not just become a Hindu? It's much easier. But no, not Bantay. He was going to be a Buddhist, and he was looking for a Buddhist teacher, and eventually he found one. And he says, the translator, this is something that Bantay used to like to think of himself as, the archetype of the translator. He gave a talk on Saint Jerome from the Christian tradition, who was a great translator of the Christian tradition. And he really looked up to and admired Saint Jerome. And he thought of himself as mainly a translator. Not in the literal sense. He didn't translate text in the literal sense, at least not many, but he translated the essence of Buddhism into ways that we in the contemporary West could understand, so that in that way he was a translator. But there's something about his eyes here. In every verse there's something about his eyes, whose deep, dark eyes never waver. Now, another thing I've been saying in the last couple of days is many of you will only know Sangharakshita from afar. You'll know him as like a public figure. Maybe you've watched him give talks or heard him give talks. Maybe you've read his books. Maybe you've seen interviews with him. And there's Sangharakshita Bantay as the public figure, but there's also Sangharakshita as the private figure. And unfortunately, not everyone was able to know him in that way, but I got to know him a little bit like that. And I've been referring to him as Sangharakshita, which is his title, his name, but also as Bantay Sangharakshita. And some of you may not know what I mean by Bantay. And Bantay is a traditional term of address to your teacher. Bantay is your teacher, and it means teacher, but it also has an element of affection to it. So the best way to translate it, I think, is dear teacher. And so his deep, dark eyes, when you got to know Bantay, Of course, a lot of communication comes from the eyes, not just with what you say, but a lot of it comes from the eyes, and a lot of what Bantay communicated to those of us who knew him came through his eyes, and his eyes were dark and brown, and they were quite deep. When you were with him, you felt you were in the presence of quite a bit of depth, quite a bit of can't think of the word, gravitas. He had a lot of gravitas to him. Next verse. Of the friendly one, he who extends a loving hand, he of the eyes that shine with kindness, the gentle and very playful one, beloved of his sons and daughters, of that man, the disciple, am I. Now you might be thinking, oh, that's his extended family, his sons and daughters. Well, he didn't literally have any sons and daughters, but those of us who are ordained by him are his sons and daughters. And the writer of this says, beloved of his sons and daughters. And those of us who knew him well and had been taught by him over a number of years, we learnt to love him as a person. Now, loving someone is different from liking someone. Sometimes people think that to love someone you have to like them, and those two are quite different things. I'm sure when you think about people you love, you don't like every aspect of them, and sometimes they probably get on your nerves. And Bantay was just like that. Bantay's a human being, and there were aspects of him that used to rub some of us up the wrong way. And you know, I fell out with him about 15 years ago. Well, I fell out with him. He didn't fall out with me, but I fell out with him. I was very, very angry with him because of some of the things he'd done and said. Nevertheless, you know, after 45 years of knowing him, I can say that I love him. I love that man. Of the friendly one. He was so friendly. He wasn't all that approachable sometimes. In some ways, he was a strange character, partly because of his upbringing, which I don't have time to tell you why he's a strange character now because of his upbringing, but just read his early memoirs and you'll find out. And I think he was probably an introvert, so sometimes it was quite hard to get much response out of him, depending on his mood. People are laughing here as though they know what I'm talking about. But there are other times when he was so lovely. The last time I saw him, it was either early this year or it was last year, I can't remember now. I was at Adistana and I just had half an hour with him, and I was talking far too loud because I thought he's an old man, he must be deaf. So after 15 minutes I said, oh, by the way, are you deaf, Bantay? No, I'm not. But the whole time I was shouting at him. He is blind though, not deaf. And he was just like, he was like this. Listening like this, because he couldn't see me but he could hear me, and he was just listening to every word, and it was absolutely a gorgeous, lovely meeting. It took me a long time, far too long, to realise Bantay was a human being. It took me a long time. To me, for far too long, he was a figure. He was a guru figure, and that was a great shame. But eventually I got there. Eventually I got to realise that he's a very, very good old friend. He who extends a loving hand. And so many times these last couple of days when people have been talking about him, the experience they had of him, he did a lot of putting people at his ease, because when people go to meet Bantay for the first time, or they have a meal with him with some others, everyone's a little bit, oh, this is Bantay, you know, the leader of the movement, the founder of the movement, this great wise man. And of course that's not very nice for him. And he would really like to put people at their ease. He just liked to be there with you as a human being, talking one human being to another. He would love that. And for the last few years at Adistana, he met so many people. Hundreds of people would go to see him, and he really, really enjoyed it. He loved human contact. And I love this part of the verse. He of the eyes that shine with kindness. And this is something that unfortunately, you don't get until you know him a bit. His eyes, they were so shiny, they were so sparkly, and they were so playful. I think it's this verse, isn't it? The very playful one. It's a great shame you haven't had this with him, but I'll just tell you one thing. The first time I ever met Bantay, Lokamitra took me up to where he lived, which is a little cottage in Norfolk. And we were going to spend the weekend with Bantay, and Bantay cooked. He cooked us a meal on the first evening, and then we had it again the second day, because he only knows how to cook one meal. But he cooked that meal for us. So that was a lovely experience. But then many, many years later at Padmaloko, I was there, I can't remember what some retreat, and I saw Bantay in the kitchen. And I said to Bantay, "Are you cooking?" kind of as a joke. And he turned round and he walked right up to me and he said, "You're a little mind reader." And it was like a bit scary, because he came right up to me, "You're a little mind reader." But he was joking. He was just joking. He was having some fun. Because he did. He cooked for us that day on the retreat. Amazing. The gentle and very playful. And there's so many playful aspects to Bantay that I could tell you about, but time is going on. So the final verse. Of the mindful one, he of the silence, he of the deep brown eyes, eyes that flash with knowing, dweller in the mystery, very hard to fathom, eluding grasping fingers, drawing me on to the horizon land, of that man, the disciple, am I. So much to say about that. Dweller in the mystery. One of the strange aspects of being with Bantay, you're just talking to him, and, you know, you're in a meeting with him talking. And there's the one level of conversation going on, but you sense this other level, this deep level. And he was quite a mysterious figure. He was very strange. He was very hard to pin down. What was Bantay like? Oh, blimey, what a question. It's so hard to describe what he was like, but there were depths to him. And he was quite a mysterious figure. He had, I suppose what it was is, as well as everything else, as well as his strange upbringing and his very complex character, he had deep insight. He really knew the Dharma, and that came with every conversation you had. You suspected these hidden depths all the time. And sometimes they weren't hidden. Sometimes he would tell you what he was thinking. Of the mindful one, he of the silence. And he was a lover of silence, and he'd be happy to sit with you in silence. Of the deep brown eyes, eyes that flash with knowing. Yes.
So you've got a few minutes, but we could have a shorter tea break.
No, let's. I'll finish now. Hard to fathom. Drawing me on to the horizon land. This is a lovely phrase. Bantay was quite controversial, as you know, and sometimes his teachings, not everyone agreed with his teachings, but he used to tell us that he didn't think that enlightenment was a fixed point, but enlightenment was as far as you could see on the horizon. And as you moved towards enlightenment, you got towards that horizon, and there was a further horizon, then you went a bit further, and you just kept on going. So I think that's what that refers to, drawing us all to the horizon land. And I want to finish by just telling you something about the Buddha and one of his disciples. I've said this a few times in the last few days in various contexts, so forgive me if you're hearing this again, but it's well worth repeating. I was looking in the Pali Canon just a few months ago, and I found this marvellous sutta discourse where this old man, Nicola Pitu, who was old and he was ill, and he got himself to see the Buddha. He managed to get to the Buddha, and he said, "Buddha, Bhagavan, Lord, will you give me a teaching specifically for me in my state? I'm old and I'm ill. Give me a teaching for that." And the Buddha did. I won't tell you what that was. You can look it up, Nicola Pitu, in the Pali Canon. But what happened next is the thing that really touched me very deeply. What happened next was the Buddha and Nicola Pitu went their different ways. I think Nakula Pitu, sorry, not Nicola Pitu, Nakula Pitu. They went their separate ways. And then Shariputra, one of the Buddha's great disciples, came along, and he saw Nakula Pitu sitting there, and he said, "Oh, you look really bright. Your skin is golden. It's like light is shining out of you. Has the Buddha just been teaching you?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, more than that, he said, "The Buddha has just sprinkled me with the deathless." the Buddha has just sprinkled me or anointed me with the deathless. I was so moved by that I looked it up and I found the Pali. So the Pali for the deathless is amata, and this is the mystery. This is the great mystery in the Dharma. What the Buddha realized with the deathless state, not eternal life, not life going on and on forever, but beyond life and death, the deathless state, the amata. And the Buddha had just been teaching Nakalapittu, and he felt that what the Buddha had done is he sprinkled him or anointed him or consecrated him with the deathless. So the word is abhisito, which means literally to sprinkle or to anoint. And it's what happens, you know, at various ceremonies. We have this in the ordination ceremony. When you're getting ordained, you bow before the person who's ordaining you, and they pour just a little bit of water on the crown of your head with the what's called the initiation vase. And that's what that represents. It's the deathless being poured into you. And this is what Nakalapittu felt, that he had been anointed or consecrated like a king with the deathless. And that's what I feel Bantay did for me. So I know that Bantay wasn't a perfect man. I know that sometimes he was unskillful. He was a human being. He wasn't a Buddha. But what's important to me was the fact that he anointed me with the deathless. And I think that's the essence of the teacher-disciple relationship, is that you feel that you've been anointed, you've been sprinkled, consecrated with the deathless. And I think Bantay did that to me, and he did it for many, many other people. And I think the movement, the order in the movement, the Triratna Buddhist order and the Buddhist community, what Bantay has done is he's sprinkled the whole thing with the deathless.